It was 2 days before the big. Oh, and another thing I have to tell you, my voice is a monotone, so it's deep and it's a monotone. So there might not be any inflection in what I'm
You're great.
reading.
Great.
So
You're great.
so just be kind to me. But it was 2 days before the big celebration. Georgiana stood at the huge parlor window at the front of the house. It had been raining quite heavily for about 3 hours. Even though it was early afternoon, a heavy darkness hung over the French Quarter. She watched drops of water splash on the petals of the new magnolia blossoms. Georgiana was quietly praying that the rain would end before Friday evening. Through the downpour, she saw a carriage stop in front of the house. A few minutes later, a man emerged, protected by the umbrella held by his carriage man. She immediately recognized the gentleman. It was Warren. Her heart skipped a beat. Before Warren could reach the door knocker, Georgiana opened the door. She stood there, face to face with the friend who had once defended and protected her. After what seemed an eternity, she finally was able to speak. Good afternoon. Please forgive me for arriving unannounced. Georgiana's first instinct was to close the door and make this all go away. But she took a parasol from the large vase in the foyer and left the house with Warren without informing anyone. Nicholas sat watching from the window of his carriage. Several minutes earlier, as he turned the corner to his home, he saw Warren and Georgiana involved what seemed from a distance to be a very intense conversation. On the day he introduced them in his office, he sensed there was some familiarity between them. He instructed his driver to wait while he observed the scene on his front porch. As Warren's carriage rode away, Nicholas decided to follow them. He was quite surprised as they entered Faubourg Treme. He wondered what business they could have in a neighborhood that housed former slaves and free men of color. They stopped in front of a small, nicely kept house. By now the rain had stopped, but the clouds in the darkness made the time appear later than it was. Nicholas instructed the driver to stay far enough away from the other carriage so as not to be seen. When Georgiana and Warren rode off in the carriage, they were unaware they were being followed. Nicholas decided he would remain silent about what he'd seen, so he had his driver ride through the quarter to give Georgiana time to arrive back home before him. He entered the house and found Georgiana curled up in her large purple chair. She had fallen asleep and did not hear him enter the room. The rain had stopped and it was almost night, but one last ray of sunshine shone through the clouds and reflected on her beautiful face. A gentle breeze brought the delicate smell of magnolias floating into the house. He could not help but notice how lovely she looked as her soft strawberry curls contrasted with the color of the chair. When Georgiana awoke, Nicholas was sitting on the window seat across from her chair. He smiled as he looked into her face. He walked over to her and extended his hand. Come, my love, it's time for dinner. After considering every possibility for what he witnessed, he decided to wait until after the party to broach the subject. Next chapter. The street was lined with fine carriages. The sounds of music and merriment flowed from the house into the street. Miss Lorraine was busy giving instructions to the house staff as Georgiana floated happily from guest to guest. Nicholas and Warren were shaking hands and talking with all the men. Note those two names. Nicholas and Warren were shaking hands and talking with all the men whose businesses would be able to make the new partnership a success. Miss Lorraine truly lived up to her reputation. The food was exquisite, the service was sheer perfection, the decorations were impeccable. What an absolutely perfect evening, Georgiana thought as she stood at the foot of the staircase and surveyed the scene. Guests were singing and dancing, enjoying the food, talking and laughing gleefully. She was positive that nothing could go wrong. Georgiana watched as one of the servants walked towards Warren carrying a silver plate with an envelope. Warren excused himself from the conversation and walked towards the French doors leading to the balcony. As he read the note, he stared into the night sky for a brief moment. Then he turned to scan the crowd. Finally, his eyes met Georgiana's, and she knew. As Warren was walking towards Georgiana, she very gently shook her head no and walked in the opposite direction. She could not allow herself to think about what she knew he would say. After all, she was expected to cheerfully entertain her guest. Nicholas was talking with a group of men near the piano, but his eyes and attention were on Warren and his wife. Finally, the party was over. The guests were gone. Georgiana and Nicholas had settled in for the night. The room was the room was dark except for a very pale glow from the half moon. Nicholas was staring morosely at the ceiling. He was trying to decide when and how to approach his wife. He thought he heard a sound above the swaying of the branches of the tall magnolia trees outside their bedroom window. He realized it was Georgiana softly and gently crying in her pillow. Something in his soul said she would not want to talk. Something told him simply to hold and comfort her. There would be time for questions later. Georgiana rose early Saturday morning, put on her clothes, and left the house. Nicholas lay in bed with his eyes closed. He was contemplating what he should do next. He got up quickly and dressed. The buggy was still in the carriage house, so he knew Georgiana was on foot. He assumed she was returning to the little house in Faubourg Treme, so he started walking in that direction. From a block away, Nicholas saw Warren's carriage parked in front of the mystery dwelling. He went to the side of the house and stood below the first window. It was slightly open. He stayed very still and listened intently. He heard Warren and a woman speaking. Nicholas looked inside but did not see Georgiana. He moved to the second window. As Nicholas stretched to peer in, he saw her. She was alone in the room. Nicholas continued to stare through the window. He saw tears falling from his wife's eyes. As Nicholas took the long walk home from the little house in Treme to his home on Iberville, his mind tried to understand the things he had just seen and heard. He walked past the site of the old slave markets. He thought about the stories he had been told of slave trade and slave breeding in the South. He tried to envision the horrors that had taken place as slaves were displayed on stages erected between the magnolia trees. People were auctioned off with less respect than one shows for cattle. As he watched a group of black children running and playing in the streets, he reflected on his own heritage. He thought about the former slaves that worked at his home, men and women that he considered not just employees, but also friends. He thought about his mother and father, how the family had prospered and flourished. He remembered all the love they had shown him and the things they had taught him. He thought about his beautiful wife, the love he felt for her, and the wonderful life they had together. He thought about his children, and then he prayed. When Nicholas entered the house, he heard the children laughing out on the patio. He quietly slipped upstairs to his bedroom. He desperately needed solitude and quiet. He knew Georgiana would return home soon. He had to prepare himself for the long-awaited conversation. He heard the front door open and shut. Several seconds later, she walked through the door of their bedroom. "Good morning, my dear." Nicholas was sitting with his back to the door. He was looking out the window at the children playing. He did not turn to face his wife as he greeted her. Georgiana could not respond. She knew she had to say something to her husband as to why she had left the house so early on a Saturday morning. On her walk home, she tried and tried to think of any reason that would have caused her to slip out of their bed and leave their home without telling him a word. She knew the lies she had concocted would not satisfy him, So she stood still and silent. In a very calm, steady voice, he said, I saw you this morning with Warren. Georgiana could not breathe. Her entire body was ice cold. Nicholas motioned towards the chair next to him. Come, sit down. I have something to tell you, and you get no more.
I love it. I love it.
It's almost over. No one, either from Louisiana, black, white, Creole, whatever, male, female, young, old, no one who has read the book has guessed the ending, because I finished the book and let it sit, and this much of it, I wasn't sure what I would do. There are typical endings to this story, to this Louisiana story. But I said, okay, why spend all this time in my heart and my love writing this book for a typical ending, especially
Right.
with my family. I could have guessed that. No.